Ahoy, friends. I have acquired a new British locomotive. And, Hello there, folks. Today I decided I would showcase my collection of Great Western Railway and British locomotives in general. Now, for the most part, they're not on the main layout. They actually have their own little table, and yep, they have kind of a little first radius circuit layout sort of thing. And basically, here's the whole lot. Something I'm particularly proud of is that this entire lineup of British locomotives that I've bought from different sources and for different purposes, absolutely every single one of them is Great Western green, or at least a dark shade of Brunswick green. All bar two of them are locomotives that would have been built at Swindon Locomotive Works of the western region of British Railways. They form a very impressive lineup, and I think Mr. Brunel himself would have been very pleased with me. Yes, they are a venerable collection on a pedestal at the moment, showcasing Swindon pride, Great Western, and here they all match, and they all. Well, there's a new one, but for the most part, they're all Great Western green, and they all match, hang on. So this locomotive is a recent purchase off of Amazon. We were ordering a few other things, and out of sheer curiosity, I looked for it. Normally I don't enjoy giving money to Jeff Bezos, but in this case they were selling this locomotive at a massively undercut price, and shipping was free, and it actually shipped from Kentucky of all places, and it arrived within 3 days, and I'm very taken by it. Let's just let's get this out of the way. Well, Rocky, what is it? I hear none of you ask. It is the new 2020 range Hornby Terrier tank. They actually came out with a brand new tooling for these just last year, and that's part of why I was so surprised to find them on Amazon of all places. I was going to do a video where I went through taking out of the packaging and all that, but I was just so excited that I kind of skipped that step and just put it on the track immediately. There are professionals out there who do locomotive reviews in very great detail, but I don't have the patience to not just instantly take it out of the box, if you know what I mean. And I'm glad I didn't do it on camera because bits of it came off, but that's okay. Now, this box feels good. It feels very professional. There is very good graphic design going on with this. And I particularly like how they have the top of the engine printed on the top of the box. That's very clever, because like I think if you had a whole bunch of these on a shelf, and you just looked at the top and you knew what it was, I think that's kind of cool. And they also have the traditional little end stamp. And apparently this locomotive is capable of accepting a DCC chip. And should I find one, and a place to take it with DCC and friends, I might actually consider popping a chip in. Something I think is quite neat that Hornby's done with their packaging also that I didn't really notice was they've actually carried over the 1950s British Railways cycling lion emblem, because British Railway, that's no longer a crest, so the Hornby can use it. And they also include the real-life power rating of the engine, which comes from the LMS, London Midland Scottish Railway system, which I think goes from 0 to 9 in terms of power. So 9 being the most powerful, and 0p being, well, this little guy. You know, it's yay long. They also include a history of the locomotive with the well, I don't need that box to ramble on several pages of history about this thing all by myself. So anyways, the Terrier tank, basically, hang on. During the 1860s, the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway appointed a new chief mechanical engineer, William Stradley. William Stradley actually didn't design very many engines, but the few engines he did design were incredible and lasted a very long time. Now this is probably his most lived example, or long-lived example. This is the Terrier tank of 1870. These originally came out as a result of a need for more powerful locomotives running the commuter services around London. And as you saw by the 0p power rating of this, I'd imagine that the little 240 tanks that they were using before would have been like -1p or something. So the solution was this little compact 6-wheel tank locomotive, which had a little bit more oomph than things like the Jenny Linds and other small locomotives that they were probably trying to use beforehand. These little things had pretty good acceleration because they had small wheels and a decently sized boiler for the time. And an interesting little trick that these locomotives had, because these things were working in 1870s London, which is already a pretty smog-ridden place, they actually have this pipe that comes from the smoke box that leads into both of the tanks. And what this does is in certain places in London, where there are lots of tunnels and so on, you can actually convert this engine into a condensing locomotive, where instead of shooting up exhaust through the chimney and drawing on the fire and creating more steam that way, it actually sends the exhaust smoke, or exhaust steam rather, into the water tanks. And by doing this, you eliminate all the smoke. The only trouble is that, you know, this is cold water, and for injectors to work, it needs to be below a certain temperature, and then by taking the hot steam and smoke and then going back into the tanks, you'd end up with the water being too hot to get into the boiler, and then there's a problem because then you're running out of water, and you have water but you can't put it in, and I'd imagine that wouldn't be fun. Another interesting detail with these locomotives, and I guess it makes sense for a commuter engine, is that they are tank locomotives. They're passenger tanks. And unlike a lot of the later designs, you know, where they were real massive passenger tank locos, these were just, you know, tiddly little things that could go backwards as well as forwards with a train of 4 or 5 of the little 4-wheel coaches. Overall, though, for the 1870s, these things weren't anything particularly unique or special. But the really crucial thing about these engines is that they lasted a really, really long time, except for mine specifically. These locomotives, I believe I filmed 2 of these when I was over at the Bluebell Railway in an earlier video. These lasted from the 1870s all the way up until 1964 in regular service. And for some more context for my American viewers, these engines were only built about a year after the completion of the original Transcontinental Railroad, and by the end of their service life, they would have been contemporaries with General Motors diesels like this one. And the real crazy part also with the Terrier tanks isn't that they ran almost continuously for 100 years by being passed down through different railways. It's that some of the preserved ones, including Stepney of the Bluebell Railway, and I believe Fenchurch too, were bought directly from British Railways after being used for so long, and then the heritage railways that bought them continued to use them, and I do believe there are something like 10 of these locomotives in preservation around the UK, and 1 in Canada. And they still run them, and I think that's just incredible that they were able to survive for so long by being just, you know, kind of ordinary, otherwise, tank locomotives. Now, as a art student, I really not only admire the proportions on this engine, but the paint and the colors are really, really, oh, they're, stuff like that is the main reason why I like 19th century locomotives as much as I do. They just look great. The reason for this is sort of twofold. It's partly because these locomotives were kind of the height of technology, and also you had child laborers who could clean the locomotives afterwards, and that every railroad did that. But all I'm saying is that around the year 1900, you notice that most of the locomotives are completely black. Part of it also has to do with the fact that the coal that they use for locomotives in the UK is a soft form of anthracite, whereas most American engines burn bituminous coal, and bituminous coal really makes a mess. And anthracite, it creates dirt, but it's a little bit more tame. Oh yeah, I haven't actually gotten to point out the interesting part, which is the actual color of this engine. The story goes, and I actually used this story and this engine to complete one of my core classes last semester, well, the previous semester. So, these were designed by grumpy old man William Stroudley, and apparently he was colorblind. Historians are still going back and forth because modern physicians say that he probably was colorblind, and I'm sure people at the time might have told him that, but he was such a grumpy old umbrella-tapping old man that I think they were just kind of afraid to actually tell him, sort of thing. But basically, this color scheme is called Improved Engine Green, or Stroudley Green, and you'll notice something very apparently when I you might notice if you're a color expert that that's not really green, kinda like this is green, right? This is what green is, and then that's kind of not that, and yeah, and at the same time, this sort of ochre color, I don't really think anybody minded when he came up with this color scheme for his locomotives, because it is exceptionally pretty. It also, I think, doesn't help that a trouble with the researching a lot of these 19th century locomotives for museum historic purposes is the fact that there's no color pictures of most of them, and so actually knowing what color half of them are comes from historical knowledge, although thankfully, because these things were around so long and were passed through so many people's hands directly, we have a pretty confident idea that these would have been this sort of color, because there were first primary sources at the time who were involved with these specific engines. And yeah, that said though, I do have to give a few marks against Hornby, because in my opinion, having seen the real Stepney locomotive at Bluebell, and having observed the color very closely and taking lots of pictures, I personally think that this shade here isn't quite the right shade. I think it's a little bit too yellow, if that makes sense. Because when I looked at the engine up close, it is more of a tan. It looks a little closer to green, I would say, actually. And yeah, at the same time though, it's so beautifully done that I'm not really one to complain. Just the finesse, camera focus. The finesse on all the pinstriping is just incredible, and they nailed the font with the name. And speaking of engine names, these engines were all named after places in London, and so that's why we have Leadenhall, the one I mentioned a few times, Stepney, and Fenchurch, and there's a Piccadilly, all kinds of different. Oh, there's Box Hill too, and yeah, a lot of them got renamed later, but originally they were all named after places in London. And that brings us to our example, Leadenhall, and I did a little bit of research on this engine, and apparently she was scrapped as early as 1901, which I'm not really, I don't have a problem with that, because the rest of them were kicking around for 90 years, whereas this one, by 1901 it would have already been kind of old anyways. And something that I think is important to consider with a lot of the preserved historic machinery we have is that it's the reason why a lot of locomotives from certain periods are missing from the sort of evolutionary chain of locomotives, if you will, is partly because a lot of them weren't really considered historic at the time. They were just kind of considered old locomotives. So that's why I actually think that when the diesel era was kind of good that it happened as early as it did, because even with British Rail, for example, by the end of the 60s they already had plenty of engines to replace this with, steam engines, and there is a decent sporting chance that if they continued on with steam and replaced these all with more modern steam engines, we wouldn't have any of them left today. Some more details that I find particularly fun about this locomotive, and that Hornby actually models extremely well with this new revision, are the brakes on it. Now, if you look at other locomotives that have brake shoes that are modeled, if I just grab one of my Great Western engines real quick. This one's from the 1920s, I believe. It'll sit on the track. You'll notice that the brake shoes that are modeled are, they're that real thin, fine little brake shoe there, and then by comparison, the ones on the Terrier are these big chunks. And the reason being is because this engine is modeled as it was in the 1870s, and it has wooden brake shoes. And so, I think I might consider painting those. Just taking the brake rigging off and then painting those real quick. I won't touch anything else on this with a paintbrush because I would definitely mess it up. But yeah, those are wooden brake shoes right there. And the cab interior on this thing is insane for how tiny it is. They actually have the little handbrake lever modeled in there, amongst other things. And I'm definitely got to put people on this one too. Hang on a second. Yeah, this model is gorgeous. Some of the detail is very, very frail, and I am afraid to touch a lot of the lamp irons, but yeah, this cab is gorgeous. Something also that I'd like to point out is the little Westinghouse pump on this engine. And yes, this is an original feature because George Westinghouse's air brake system came out in 1865, I believe, and it wasn't legally mandated in America until 1893's Railway Equipment Act, which also mandated the knuckle couplers. And yes, the London, Brighton, South Coast Railway, which built these, they did run with air brakes. Also, my apologies for the fluctuating audio quality. There is running machinery behind me that, yeah. But yeah, the London, Brighton, South Coast Railway was actually one of the world's first railways to convert to air brakes. And that beats out things like a lot of the American railroads like the Pennsylvania and so on. And part of that, I think, is also because the London, Brighton, South Coast has less equipment, rolling stock-wise, and is less big than some of the American railways that we're converting. But that's really important to think about because it wasn't cars like this would have been around all the way into the, in the U.S. at least, would have been all the way around till like the 1890s, rolling around with no air brakes. And meanwhile, this little British railway, with equipment that arguably doesn't need it as badly as the big American cars do, was running with air brakes. And what's also kind of weird about that is some of the Scottish railways, like the Caledonian, ran with air brakes too. And what I find really funny about that is later on, the British rail network converted to vacuum brakes, at least for passenger trains. And oh yeah, so basically if you want to assign blame to anybody for the British having air brakes and then getting hooked on vacuum brakes and then now in more recent times switching back to air brakes, you can kind of blame us for it because the American inventor named Eames showed up with his very own locomotive and his own set of coaches and showed up to do an air brake comparison trial with his vacuum brake system. And I don't know if it's his system or somebody else's vacuum system that they use in the UK now, but this weird little locomotive is part. So yeah, I do apologize for you guys had the Westinghouse brake, and then we convinced you not to use it, even though this one actually does have the Westinghouse pump. Sorry, England, you guys had our system right the first time, if that made any sense. Yeah, I mean, I'm so used to American model trains not having any cab interior detail, even more modern releases. So this is really kind of blowing me away, because not only is there a lot of detail in there, but a lot of it is painted. And I mean, I know compared to other British models, this probably isn't too impressive, because the gauges don't have numbers on them. But just look at that. They have the little sight glasses in there. The regulator, the little handle there, is a separate piece. The reversing lever, which I thought was kind of a funny feature on the actual engine when I was looking at it, is that the reversing lever is kind of at a weird angle because there isn't enough room in the cab for it to actually fit. So when it's on every other steam engine I've seen, the reversing handle, neutral for it is upright, and then forward is pushing it forward and then back. Whereas this one, the middle position's kind of leaned back a little bit because otherwise it just doesn't fit in the cab. Which again, really cool they were able to capture that detail. The little railings to get into the cab too are exceptionally fine. And this is also a prototype correct thing that I noticed that I thought was kind of funny about the real engine, is that these splashers really do come up into the cab like this. It really is a cramped little thing to operate, and it makes sense that this is from 1870 or so, because I'd imagine that the people crewing this at the beginning of its lifespan probably were at least a little bit shorter than the people crewing it at the end in the 1960s. So something I do find kind of amusing about this engine is that the coal bunker at the back of the cab, this bit here, is about as wide and as long as the toolbox that's sitting behind it. So this, it's because one of the troubles that these particular engines had for a long time was coal supply. In some of the later variant engines that Hornby, I believe, also made in this range, they actually have an extended thing on the back of the bunker, like Stepney, I think, has, or is it the Isle of Wight ones that have this, where the bunker comes up to like here, and so the windows are almost useless unless because they're piling coal way up to like here-ish, and then of course there's also pictures of these on the Hailing Island route where they actually, because they had such a small coal supply, they would actually be piling some on top of the roof just to get a little bit more distance out of it. Which again, I just find that amusing, because I think if I was to come up with a solution to that, depending on how the weight distribution was, I would probably just make the bunker come out to the back all the way, and then move the toolbox somewhere else, because I can't imagine what would be in a toolbox that big. Probably extra lamps and maybe a shovel or something. But I guess there's also the approach of my Great Western approach, where they just, instead of having a toolbox on the the bunker for the shovel, they just have these little hooks for the shovel, and it just kind of sits in the back. Although they also had a toolbox on the side, which obviously I don't know how you would really make one of those fit. Maybe if you put the toolbox like there, yeah. Well, actually, there's not enough width for that, because the Terrier is a bit thinner than other British locomotives. Like that's just something else I find very, very charming about this engine, is just the proportions. It's very. I think that's why I like Victorian engines in general, is that, like, compared to a lot of the later, more serious locomotives, I guess, the proportions on them are just more fun. But if you look at this, sorry, getting in the way. You'll notice that even though these run on the same track gauge and all that, the running plate on the 1920s era tank loco here from Great Western is a lot wider than the Terrier is, and I think part of that has to do with the fact that this is running on southern London's railways in 1870, whereas this is running on 1920s everywhere else on the Great Western sort of setup, and they've got wider platforms and all that. Also, the size relationship between the top of the chimney and the top of the cab, the fact that there is room to make the cab taller, but they just kind of chose not to, is also, I think, a very Victorian thing. This thing is antiquated in such a beautiful way, and I I can't get over it, and Hornby did such a wonderful job replicating it. So just off camera earlier, I did have this engine running around the main loop for about 30 minutes in each direction, a little more, and it is absolutely silky smooth. It's at the lower end of the speed range. It is a little bit jumpy though, but at the same time it makes absolutely no noise, and it's very, very satisfying to watch. I might put it on the other layout though, just because this is the land of the cow catcher and the headlight and the roller freight, and I don't know if it looks right. Oh, Mr. Eisenhower, am I allowed to use this here? I think he's okay with it. It's not part of the military-industrial complex. So let's just this is kind of like the one in Canada that has the air brakes and all, but it's got the air brakes, and we can make stuff coupled to it, and So as I say, this locomotive has been run-in, but is otherwise pretty much brand new. It has a little bit of a limp when the wheels come down, but it seems to be okay most of the time. This is about as... It's not quite... It takes a little bit more voltage than this to get smooth and purely steady, but... Yeah, it seems to be a little bit worse in reverse, but... Yeah. I think it's because this one isn't quite geared down far enough, because it runs a little faster than I think it ought to be able to. But yeah, I'd say that this thing runs pretty respectably, especially considering that this one from Amazon cost $86 US, which is less than the 99 Great British pounds that I believe it usually costs. I think it might be less than that, but still, pretty attainable little locomotive. Not necessarily cheap, but you can see where the money went into this. It is, for a tiny little thing, it is exceptional. And I just wish more US manufacturers would make steam engines, nice ones, that were this affordable. Because I know that several of them, well, off the top of my head, I can only really think of Bachmann that has their 6-wheel tank locomotives that are occasionally in stock. Like, I've been trying to get my hands on one for a long time, but never been able to find one at a good price. Theirs are, well, compared to this one and how complex all of the paintwork and all of the internal details and so on are, it's really nothing. And I wish U.S. manufacturers, or at least U.S. prototype manufacturers, would, think to give us some more budget-friendly locos like this that are still quite nice. I love the look of this thing when it's underneath the lights of the signal too. Like, I don't know what it is. I think it's because I'm subconsciously remembering childhood Thomas the Tank Engine memories, watching episodes with Stepney in them, and I believe there's there's a story where there's a signal, and Actually, I'm actually, hang on a second. I got a funny in mind.
Clunk! Down went the signal. "Stop!" yelled the fieldsman. But Stepney's noisy starting drowned their shouts. "Come along! Come along!" he puffed to the trucks. "Wake up, Caroline," they said. Caroline coughed crossly, reluctantly came to life, and they rolled out onto the road. Stepney wasn't hurrying. He had just crossed the river when Caroline came up behind. "Toot, toot," she wailed. Road and rail ran side by side. "If these jokers want a race," remarked the driver, "they can have one."